At 4:30 a.m. on August 8, 2007, the Rowland Heights neighborhood of Los Angeles was still wrapped in the quiet of the late night, with most residents sound asleep. But that peace was shattered suddenly by a woman's piercing scream cutting through the darkness, a sound so sharp and anguished that anyone who heard it would have jolted awake instantly. From inside one of the houses in the residential area, an Asian woman came rushing out into the street in a state of complete panic, her hair disheveled and wild. Her steps were unsteady, nearly falling several times as she ran down the empty road, and there were red stains visible on her body. The woman ran to the nearest neighbor's house and began pounding on the door frantically. When no one answered, she continued on to another house, running down the street and knocking on door after door in what appeared to be a complete loss of control. Her voice was hoarse from screaming, but she kept crying out desperate pleas for help. "Help me! Please, someone help me! Save my husband! Save my children!" The continuous screaming and door pounding in the dead of night woke the surrounding residents and filled them with unease, but not knowing what was happening and frightened by the unusual situation. Most people didn't dare open their doors right away, instead, standing behind their locked doors, listening to the commotion outside. Finally, a male neighbor who knew the woman's family recognized her and bravely opened his door to step outside and see what was going on. He ran quickly toward the woman who was crying hysterically, trying to ask what had happened and why she was in such a state. But the woman seemed completely exhausted, her legs no longer able to support her, and as the neighbor tried to help her up, she collapsed to the ground. She kept mumbling the same words over and over, her voice broken and trembling. They're all dead. They're all dead. By this time, many residents in the neighborhood had begun opening their doors and stepping outside to see what was happening. The crowd grew larger, people whispering to each other. Among the curious onlookers, a few decided to run straight into the woman's house to see what could have caused her such panic. But what they saw when they crossed the threshold left them frozen in shock. Right in the middle of the living room lay a man motionless in a large pool of blood that had spread across the floor. The victim's body looked as if it had been savaged by some wild animal. Blood wasn't just on the floor, it had splattered everywhere in the room. Anyone looking at the scene could immediately tell that an extremely violent and bloody attack had taken place there. Those who witnessed the horrifying scene immediately ran out in terror and quickly called the police. While waiting for authorities to arrive, the Asian woman remained sitting motionless on the front steps of her house, her demeanor distraught and disturbed. She sat there with a vacant look in her eyes, her mouth continuously mumbling the same words mechanically. I don't know what happened. I just wanted to save my children. I just wanted to save my children." When the Los Angeles Police Department cruiser arrived at the scene, the Asian woman had calmed down somewhat thanks to the comfort and assistance of the neighbors around her. However, she still hadn't fully recovered from the state of shock, with small, broken sobs still escaping from her throat. 2 officers dispatched to the scene quickly entered the house to assess the situation, and the moment they pushed the door open and stepped inside, the strong, pungent smell of fresh blood immediately hit them. Inside, the entire living room was in an unusually chaotic and disorderly state. Throughout the room, from the sofa area to the floor to the corners of the walls, scattered footprints were imprinted in the blood. Lying right in the center of the living room was a man's body in an extremely gruesome condition. The victim's face had been slashed with some sharp object, and from his chest and abdomen to all 4 limbs, there were countless stab and slash wounds from a knife, some of the wounds deep, with blood from those injuries having pooled into a large puddle around the body. The scene was truly horrifying beyond words. A veteran detective on the police team slowly knelt beside the victim's body and began carefully checking whether the man showed any remaining signs of life. However, when his hand touched the victim's body, he immediately realized the man's body had been cold and stiff for quite some time. After checking the condition of the male victim downstairs, the officers continued to search the remaining areas of the house. They opened the door leading upstairs and began climbing the stairs to check the bedrooms above. Having been informed by neighbors that there were also 2 small children in the family, the officers quickly made their way to the children's room located to the left of the master bedroom. When they arrived, they noticed the door was slightly ajar, and from inside the room emanated an eerie, deathly silence. One officer reached out to flip the light switch, and when light flooded the room, the sight before them left everyone frozen. On the small nightstand next to the children's bed was a comic book that had been left open, and beside it, a stuffed animal that had fallen over on its side. On the bed, two young boys lay quietly side by side in neat positions, at first glance appearing to simply be deep in sleep. But upon closer inspection, the officers noticed that both children's lips had turned a purplish-blue color, and on their young faces were distinctive marks showing they had died of asphyxiation. Immediately, police secured the entire crime scene and called for the forensic team and crime scene investigation unit to conduct an in-depth investigation. After completing preliminary examinations, experts determined that the two children showed no signs of resistance or struggle on their bodies, indicating they had very likely been killed while sound asleep. Meanwhile, examination of the man's body downstairs revealed a total of 92 knife wounds. What kind of hatred, what depth of resentment could drive a person to such brutality and loss of control? An entire family of 4, and now only the wife remained alive. This horrific family massacre left all the police officers and investigators involved in the case in heavy silence. The method of the killings, the deliberate brutality, and the systematic way all 3 victims were murdered clearly indicated this was a premeditated killing planned in advance. And in this situation, the only person who could know the full truth about what happened in that house that night was the suspiciously surviving Asian woman sitting right in front of them. The female homeowner, named Zheng Manling, recounted to police what she said had happened the night before. According to her statement, that evening, after she had put her 2 young sons to bed, she found that she herself couldn't fall asleep. So she decided to go for a drive to clear her head. She said that as she was preparing to leave the house, her husband Williams was still sitting at the computer absorbed in playing games, so she quietly took the car keys and left. She drove to a hilltop near where they lived, where she sat in the car enjoying the cool breeze. Then at some point, she fell asleep in the car without realizing it. Manling continued, saying that around the early morning hours, she suddenly woke up startled from a nightmare. After waking and realizing she had fallen asleep in the car for several hours, she hurriedly drove back home. But what she never expected was that when she stepped foot into her own house, she found her husband and 2 children already dead. That was why she had run out into the street in such a panicked state, calling for help. However, the detectives and investigators of the Los Angeles Police Department were all experienced professionals, and they certainly couldn't simply take Manling's one-sided account at face value. Instead, they conducted a thorough examination of the entire crime scene to search for evidence. The sharp-eyed detectives quickly discovered several suspicious points. First, they noted that all the doors and windows of the house were completely intact, showing no signs of anyone having broken locks or pried open doors to break in from outside. Next, when examining the kitchen area, they found that the kitchen sink showed signs of something having been thoroughly washed, and the smell of bleach in the area was very strong, much more concentrated than normal. This proved that someone had deliberately used bleach to clean and destroy evidence of the murder weapon. Additionally, when analyzing the wounds on the male victim's body, forensic experts noted that all the wounds showed considerable consistency in depth and angle, and each knife blow had been delivered with great precision. Such cold brutality and precision indicated the killer must have harbored deep-seated hatred toward the victim. When all the clues and evidence collected at the scene were put together, LAPD detectives almost immediately concluded that Manling was the prime suspect and the only suspect in this horrific family massacre. Every trace, every detail at the scene pointed in one direction, and the woman sitting crying in front of her house with a pained expression was the subject who needed to be interrogated more thoroughly. During the intensive interrogations that followed at the police station, Manling initially tried to maintain her position and firmly denied all accusations against her. However, under the pressure of continuous questioning and undeniable evidence presented before her, her composure began to crumble. At times she burst into tears and repeatedly said desperately, "I didn't kill them. I didn't kill them. I was just so tired." Her voice at that moment sounded so pitiful, as if she were the victim in this entire tragic story. But not long after, perhaps because she could no longer bear the mounting psychological pressure, or because she realized all denials were meaningless in the face of clear evidence, Manling finally decided to confess to everything. She began to recount the true story of what happened that fateful night. According to Manling's confession, she said that before the incident she had had a very strange and frightening dream, in which she saw her husband Williams kill her and their 2 sons. The dream was so vivid and realistic that when she woke up she felt it wasn't just an ordinary dream, but a warning, an omen sent from heaven to tell her what the future would hold if she didn't take action. Manling went on to explain that she wasn't an evil or wicked person at all, she simply wanted to start a new life. She said this in a tone so calm it was frightening. In this woman's mouth, what she called starting over had to be exchanged for the lives of 3 people. To better understand the path that led to this horrific crime, police conducted a deeper investigation into Zhang Manling's background and past. What they discovered revealed a dark picture of this woman's life from a very young age. Zhang Manling was born in Taiwan into a family with 4 siblings. Her parents at the time were both very young, not truly ready either psychologically or financially to accept the responsibility of raising children, so Manling's birth, like those of her siblings, was considered an unplanned accident. Manling's mother was a woman with a very strong and domineering personality, but severely lacking patience when facing life's difficulties, and whenever she encountered any obstacle or problem, she would blame everything on her husband. Meanwhile, Manling's father wasn't a mild-mannered man either. He was hot-tempered and quick to anger, so there wasn't a peaceful day in their household. And many times, when her parents' rage reached its peak and they needed somewhere to vent the negative emotions boiling inside them, little Manling became the target of that frustration. In normal families, children are typically treated as precious treasures in their parents' hands, loved, cared for, and protected from all harm. But in Manling's family, the children were more like inanimate punching bags, existing there for their parents to take out their anger on. Growing up in such a family environment, Manling became an extremely sensitive and quiet child from an early age. After her family immigrated to the United States to live and work, Manling's situation became even worse because she had to face the additional barrier of language in the new country. In that situation, Manling gradually learned to observe and read adults' expressions to gauge their moods. She learned to stay silent to avoid causing trouble for herself, and she learned to force herself to appear obedient and compliant in every situation, no matter how much pain or anger she was feeling inside. But the harsh reality was that no matter how hard she tried to be good, she could never make her parents happy or satisfied. Whenever they were in a bad mood for whatever reason, violence could occur without warning. When Manling started attending school in America, she faced another kind of hell outside the home. At school, her Asian skin color, her slightly different accent when speaking English, and the different cultural habits of an immigrant child made her stand out and seem out of place among the American-born students. She became a target of bullying by other children at school, frequently excluded from friend groups, mocked and ridiculed about her origins. There were times she was even dragged into the bathroom by other children and had water thrown on her, or had her backpack snatched and thrown away. And even when adults or other students saw what was happening to her, they would just ignore it and walk away as if nothing was happening because Manling was so quiet and never spoke up to complain or ask anyone for help, so nobody bothered to care about the little girl's fate. She once tried to fit in, tried to make friends. One time, she secretly used her saved-up pocket money to treat everyone to ice cream. That day, she seemed to truly become someone liked. From then on, she kept repeating this method, buying snacks and giving small gifts to exchange for others' smiles until the money ran out and the friends disappeared along with it. But Manling learned a cruel lesson. Relationships can be bought. To continue making friends, she even started secretly taking money from home. But when her parents discovered this, she received a beating. That night, she sat in the corner of her room, hugging her knees tightly, her head buried in her arms. She didn't cry. In others' eyes, she was a quiet, well-behaved girl, but deep inside, rage and suppression had taken over her entire world. As an adult, Manling still couldn't escape the shadows of her childhood. She tried hard to study, to work, wanting to live a normal life. When Manling was 19, she met the man she believed would completely change her fate, Williams. Williams was a co-worker she met at work, an American guy with a kind face who smiled often, whose way of speaking was somewhat shy and bashful, but exuded an endearing sincerity. As the two grew closer and shared their pasts with each other, Manling discovered that Williams's childhood hadn't been any better than hers. His parents had divorced when he was very young, and from then on he had to grow up in foster homes, moving from one house to another without ever having a real home to call his own. Perhaps it was because they both carried wounds from broken childhoods that these two lonely souls found understanding in each other and gradually came together. In the early days of their relationship, their feelings for each other were truly sincere and sweet. They decided to move in together, renting a modest little apartment that fit their tight budget. Every day they would go to work together to make a living, then stop by the supermarket on the way home to buy discounted vegetables, and in the evenings they would cook together and share their dreams of a brighter future. The young couple's first child was born in 2000, marking an important milestone in their lives. For the first time in her life, she felt she truly had something that belonged to her, a complete little family with a husband and child that she could call her own. She thought that finally, after so many years of suffering and loneliness, she had found the happiness she deserved. But real life is never kind and gentle to anyone forever. After the baby was born, everything in their lives suddenly changed for the much worse. Manling had to quit her job to stay home full-time caring for the child, which meant the family lost an important source of income. Meanwhile, Williams continued working as a service worker at Disney, but his wages were miserably low, not enough to cover the ever-increasing living expenses of a family with a new member. Monthly rent was frequently late and in arrears, and life became more difficult and stressful than ever before. In those difficult circumstances, Manling began developing negative emotions and complaining more and more. She criticized her husband as useless, incapable of earning money to support the family. She resented fate for being so unfair to her, and she wondered why she had foolishly married such a poor man with no future. But in reality, Williams wasn't lazy. He still went to work diligently every day and did everything within his ability to provide for the family. It was just that he had an easygoing, gentle personality, living according to circumstances rather than having fierce ambition or drive to get ahead. But Manling completely disagreed with her husband's mindset. She wanted to change their current life. She wanted to give her child a better future. With that desire, Manling began encouraging and pushing her husband to find a new job that could bring in higher income. She suggested he take a training course in insurance. Williams listened to his wife, studied diligently, and finally passed, getting his insurance license and starting work as an insurance sales agent. But after 3 months in the new field, Williams had only signed one single contract during those entire 3 months, earning so little in commission that it wasn't even enough to pay for the monthly phone bill he needed for sales calls, let alone help cover the family's living expenses. Once again, the hope Manling had placed in her husband evaporated, and she felt utterly disappointed and discouraged by the harsh reality. The meager savings the couple had set aside were dwindling by the day, while her husband seemed not to worry at all, spending entire days absorbed in gaming. During that difficult and stressful time, Manling suffered from chronic insomnia, lying in bed tossing and turning, unable to sleep even though her body was exhausted, her mind constantly spinning with worries about money, about the future, about their hopeless present life. The relationship between her and her husband grew increasingly distant, and she no longer wanted to talk or communicate with Williams because every time she saw him sitting there playing games, she felt nothing but annoyance and disappointment. Even toward her innocent young son, she became more irritable and quick to anger than before. Every time she looked in the mirror, Manling saw herself growing more haggard and aged. Looking at herself like that, a single phrase kept repeating in her mind like a haunting refrain. This isn't the life I wanted. This isn't the future I dreamed of. After many nights of thinking, Manling decided she would divorce Williams to escape this dead-end marriage. But right when she had steeled herself to go through with the divorce, She discovered she was pregnant with their second child. When Williams learned his wife was pregnant, he was overjoyed and excited. He began taking on more housework voluntarily so his wife could rest, treating Manling with great care and consideration. Not only that, he also took devoted care of their older son, spending more time with the child. Seeing these positive changes in her husband, Manling had to admit that aside from his inability to earn money, Williams was truly a kind and good-natured man with nothing really to criticize. After a long internal struggle, Manling finally decided to compromise and stay. She got a job as a server at a restaurant, hard work, but on good days when customers were generous, tips could reach $200 or even more. She consoled herself that if they just economized a bit, they could manage. And so, not long after, their second son was born. However, she only stayed home to recover for 2 weeks before hurrying back to the restaurant to continue working. From then on, Manling's life became an endless cycle of busyness and exhaustion. She worked without rest, depleted both physically and mentally, rarely having a moment truly for herself. Time passed quickly, and in the blink of an eye, their second son was already 3 years old. Thanks to that, occasionally Manling could leave the house for a bit to give herself rare moments of relaxation. It was precisely during this time that fate once again toyed with her in a dangerous game she never anticipated the consequences of. On social media, while casually scrolling through her friends list and friend suggestions one day, she reconnected with John, an old high school classmate she had lost touch with long ago. John and Manling had once had an ambiguous relationship back in their school days. At that time, due to heavy pressure from studies and family expectations, plus the fact that after graduation they each went their separate ways and gradually lost contact, that promising relationship never had the chance to go anywhere. This reunion on social media after so many years apart gave them much to talk about. They reminisced about old memories from school days and those innocent feelings from the beginning. Then the conversation gradually shifted to their present lives. Manling talked about her dead-end marriage, about her husband with no ambition. John also shared his own difficulties. Those intimate conversations made both of them feel understood and connected, a feeling Manling had been missing for so long in her cold marriage. Not long after those increasingly intimate online conversations, the old flame between them began to rekindle, and they decided to meet in person. On that fateful night, Manling called in sick to the restaurant, spent hours carefully applying makeup and choosing her best outfit. She wanted to appear before John looking her absolute best. That evening, the two shared a romantic dinner together. And after that dinner, intoxicated by wine and the longing for love she had suppressed for so long, they crossed the final boundary that a married woman should never cross. From that night on, Manling felt she had found a new source of joy in life. Every time she had a date with John, she excitedly prepared days in advance, deliberately dressing up beautifully. Those moments with John were the only times she felt she was still a real woman. When she was with him, she could temporarily forget all the chaos and hopelessness of her family, forget the mediocrity and uselessness of her husband, forget the bothersome crying of the children. But a relationship that began with deception and was built on an illegitimate foundation could never last forever. After several meetings and intimate encounters, John began showing signs of distancing himself and growing cold toward Manling. He replied to messages more slowly, found every excuse to decline dates, and his attitude was no longer as warm as in the early days. The harsh truth was that John had never truly loved Manling or thought about a serious future with her. He was simply a man looking for some short-term excitement and adventure to relieve his boring life. Finally, John told Manling directly, "We can't continue this anymore." But that statement didn't act like a bucket of cold water to wake Manling from her fantasy. Because by this point she had fallen too deeply into this relationship, she couldn't or wouldn't recognize the truth that she was just a temporary plaything to John. Instead, she convinced herself that he was distancing himself because he loved her too deeply and didn't want to make things difficult for her between love and family, didn't want to interfere in her marriage. After being rejected and cut off by John, Manling was forced to return and face a marriage she found increasingly unbearable. She looked at everything she had, A husband with no ambition, a hopeless life with no way out, and dreary days stretching endlessly with no end in sight. She felt she had reached the absolute limit of her endurance, unable to continue living like this any longer. Every time she saw Williams, no matter what he was doing, she felt a wave of disgust rise within her. Even just glancing at him was enough to make her feel irritated and annoyed. Determined to escape this suffocating marriage, Manling bravely proposed divorce to her husband. But contrary to her expectations, Williams refused the divorce request. He said the children couldn't be without their mother, that the kids needed a complete family to grow up in. But in Manling's eyes, her husband's words weren't an attempt to hold on out of love, but a cold chain strangling her freedom and future. She felt she was being imprisoned in a jail without bars, forced to continue living a life she never wanted, never chose. When the divorce didn't happen as she hoped, Manling fell into deep despair. Life continued in the same mess as before. Nothing changed, no way out appeared before her. The more she thought about her situation, the more resentful she felt, and that resentment only led to deeper despair. In her warped mind at this point, the family was no longer a sheltering home, but had become a massive prison swallowing her youth, freedom, and every dream day by day. Even her 2 sons now appeared in her eyes as nothing but heavy shackles binding her, preventing her from escaping this hellish life. In that surging wave of chaotic, negative emotions that kept rising higher, a crazed and dark thought began quietly taking root in Manling's mind. If they all no longer existed in this world, could I finally be free? On the afternoon of August 7th, 2007, the weather in Rowland Heights was especially hot and muggy, the sweltering summer heat oppressive. Manling felt unwell and asked to leave work early. When she opened the door and stepped into her house, the sight before her was a familiar chaos that drove her nearly mad. Her husband Williams was sitting in front of the computer screen, completely absorbed in his video game, his eyes glued to the screen without even noticing his wife had come home. Their older son was holding his father's cell phone, also playing games. Their younger son was in the bathroom, his face covered in dirt, his hands making a mess with toilet paper torn into pieces scattered everywhere. Manling tried to suppress the emotions churning inside her, changed her clothes and went back out, bought some groceries at the nearby supermarket. Then she returned home and prepared a simple dinner for the family. After everyone finished eating, Manling took both sons upstairs to their room to get ready for bed. She bathed each one gently and carefully, humming familiar lullabies the children loved as she washed them. After the bath, she put them to bed and told each one a bedtime story, her voice gentle and warm, as if it were just another ordinary evening like any other. "Mommy, can I have fried chicken tomorrow?" The 3-year-old looked up at his mother with bright, innocent eyes and asked with all the eager anticipation of a child. "Of course, sweetheart. Mommy will buy you fried chicken tomorrow." Manling nodded gently and answered in a soft voice. At that moment, her eyes suddenly welled up with tears, but those tears weren't an expression of sacred maternal love. They were emotions that had been suppressed too long inside her, thrashing in one final struggle. After the children fell asleep, it was nearly midnight. She stood at the door of the room, staring at their sleeping faces as if saying goodbye. Then she closed the door, quietly took a pillow from the closet, and did what we can only imagine. After finishing everything, she walked downstairs and told her husband, who was still playing games, that she wanted to go outside for some fresh air. Her husband didn't even turn around before agreeing. Manling drove off alone into the late night of Los Angeles. About 2 hours later, at midnight, Manling drove back home. She had prepared herself to face her husband's hysteria, but the house was silent, her husband still sitting red-eyed in front of the computer, clearly intending to stay up all night. So this useless man had noticed nothing at all. Without a word, Manling walked into the kitchen, took a sharp knife, and went to stand behind her husband. She began frantically swinging the blade, using almost all her strength, slashing and stabbing repeatedly at Williams's body. Manling's release of rage at fate, her dissatisfaction with her own life, and her hatred for her weak, incompetent husband, all of it was fully unleashed in that moment. When she finally stopped, She realized she was trembling violently, and Williams was unrecognizable. Manling collapsed to her knees, her mind blank. Only when the clock on the wall showed 3 a.m. did she suddenly stand up, rush out of the house, and begin her performance. After the case was exposed, the Asian American community in Los Angeles was nearly in shock. Media outlets used all kinds of headlines to describe this family annihilation: devil mother, Asian black widow, monster on earth. Some said Manling had killed her husband and children just so she could be with her lover. Almost no one could understand how a woman who appeared so gentle and meek could be so ruthlessly cruel. Some even speculated that perhaps there was another suspect in the case. And what truly defied imagination was her perfect performance after committing the crime. She ran out the door with disheveled hair and tear-filled eyes, screaming for help, fooling the neighbors, fooling the first police officers to arrive at the scene, even fooling all the onlookers along the way who pitied her. But no matter how good her acting was, it couldn't defeat evidence and investigation. At trial, Manling initially tried to defend herself, claiming she had been disturbed by hallucinations, had a nightmare, believed her husband was going to kill her and the children, so she acted in self-defense. But the prosecution quickly used ironclad evidence to refute every one of her claims. First, there were no signs of struggle in the children's room, proving the 2 children had died in their sleep without any resistance. Second, the 92 wounds on her husband's body far exceeded what would be necessary for legitimate self-defense, clearly the result of frenzied stabbing in an emotionally out-of-control state. Third, police found a cigarette pack in Manling's car on which they recovered fresh blood belonging to her husband Williams. The forensic examiner pointed out that when discovered, the 3-year-old son had tear tracks at the corners of his eyes, showing he had left this world in a state of conscious fear. When this piece of evidence was read aloud, the entire courtroom fell silent. Many in attendance burst into tears on the spot. Manling just kept her head down without saying a word. Sitting in the gallery, Williams's elderly foster mother, after hearing all the details, unexpectedly stood up to ask the judge to spare the woman's life. The mother said, "Manling has mental problems. She's also a victim. I don't blame her. I just ask that you don't sentence her to death." These words shook the entire courtroom, but the foster mother's mercy wasn't enough to change the outcome. 1 family, 3 lives. This was a brutal truth that couldn't be overlooked. The jury unanimously found Manling guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to death. She also became the first Asian American woman in California state history to receive the death penalty. To this day, Manling remains imprisoned in some prison in California, awaiting an execution date that seems infinitely far away. After the trial ended, the case quickly became a focal point of discussion across America. What kind of breakdown must a woman go through to make such a horrifying decision? Is this the making of a monster, or the tragedy of someone driven mad by life? What are your thoughts on this case? Share them in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.